So Nick Robertson is still in trade limbo with the Toronto Maple Leafs despite making the roster for the second consecutive year. And now Dreger is reporting that Brad Treliving has been fielding calls from interested teams, which begs a question. Why is Toronto dragging this out instead of just pulling the trigger and giving this kid the fresh start he clearly needs and deserves? All right, folks, we need to have a serious conversation about Nick Robertson and the Toronto Maple Leafs, because this situation has officially crossed from complicated roster management into borderline cruel to the player involved. Dreger just reported on TSN's Insider Trading that Brad Treliving has been talking with teams interested in acquiring Robertson, which means there is a market for him. There are teams willing to give him opportunity. And yet Toronto continues to keep him in this organizational purgatory, where he's technically on the roster, but has no clear path to meaningful ice time. This is the exact same position Robertson has been in for years now. And at some point you have to ask, what is Toronto actually accomplishing by holding on to him? Let's break down this entire messy situation and figure out what needs to happen next. Let's start with what Dreger actually said, because his comments paint a pretty clear picture of where things stand. During Tuesday's edition of Insider Trading, Dreger noted, "The 24-year-old finds himself once again in a very familiar position with the Toronto Maple Leafs, hoping for a bigger role, an opportunity in the National Hockey League. I know Toronto Maple Leafs general manager Brad Treliving has recently spoken with clubs that may have some interest in Nick Robertson. Given the depth that the Maple Leafs have, it's a tough spot for Robertson. Maybe it's time to give him a fresh start elsewhere." That last line is crucial. Maybe it's time to give him a fresh start elsewhere. That's Dreger, one of the most connected and respected insiders in hockey, essentially saying what many of us have been thinking for months. This relationship between Robertson and Toronto has run its course. It's not working. It's not going to work. And continuing to drag it out helps nobody. Let's recap the timeline of Robertson's saga with the Maple Leafs, because context matters. In the summer of 2024, Robertson formally requested a trade. That's not a casual thing. That's a player saying, "I don't see a future here. Please move me." The request didn't result in a trade because Toronto either couldn't find a deal they liked or decided they wanted to keep him. Robertson eventually signed a one-year extension before training camp started, presumably hoping that things would improve. Last season, Robertson actually made the NHL roster out of camp, which seemed like progress. But then he barely played. He was a healthy scratch frequently. He got limited ice time when he did dress. And when the playoffs rolled around, he was essentially invisible. 0 goals in the postseason, despite being a guy who's supposed to provide offensive punch. That's not entirely his fault. It's hard to produce when you're playing 8 minutes a night on the fourth line, but it certainly didn't help his case. This past offseason, Robertson went to salary arbitration, which is another sign of a deteriorating relationship. Players don't typically take their teams to arbitration unless negotiations have broken down. He was the last player to have his arbitration case resolved, finally signing a one-year deal worth $1.825 million on August 2nd. Then came training camp for the 2025 to 2026 season. Robertson had a strong preseason, showing the skill and scoring ability that made him a second-round pick back in 2019. He made the roster for the second consecutive year, which again seemed like progress. But here's the problem. His spot in the lineup is far from guaranteed, as the report notes. He's on the roster, but he's not really eyeing the lineup in any meaningful way. And now there's a new complication, Auston. The 19-year-old phenom has burst onto the scene, impressed in training camp, and even got a chance on the top line in his NHL debut. Cowan represents the future of the organization, a high-end prospect with superstar potential. Robertson, meanwhile, is a 24-year-old who's already been in the organization for years without establishing himself. When push comes to shove, who do you think Craig Berube is going to play? The exciting young prospect, or the guy who's been stuck in organizational limbo for years? Robertson himself seems to understand precariousness of his situation. In comments to Rosie DiMano of the Toronto Star, he said, "At this point, I can't speak to their plans and me moving forward. What I do know is I'm here and I'm giving it my all. I can't control what the future holds for me here. I'm excited to be here, back on the ice. Whatever happens to me is out of my control. so I'm going to take care of my business. That's the quote of a player who knows he's on thin ice. Pun intended. He's saying all the right things publicly, staying positive, focusing on what he can control, but you can read between the lines. He doesn't know what Toronto's plans are for him. He can't control his future. Whatever happens is out of his hands. That's not the language of a player who feels secure in his role or confident about his long-term future with the organization. Here's what really frustrates me about this entire situation. Toronto is wasting an asset. Nick Robertson has value around the league. We know this because Dreger specifically reported that teams have expressed interest and Treliving has been fielding calls. There is a market for him. There are teams that would give him the opportunity he's been seeking. And yet Toronto continues to hold on to him, keeping him in limbo, preventing him from getting the fresh start that could salvage his career. Why? What is Toronto gaining by keeping Robertson? He's not playing meaningful minutes. He's not contributing to wins. He's taking up a roster spot that could go to Auston or another young player who's actually part of the long-term plans. And his trade value is only going to decline the longer this drags on. Every day that passes where Robertson sits in the press box or plays garbage minutes is another day his value decreases. Chris Johnson reported back on September 9th that the Leafs were open to moving Robertson and were open to returns given their sparse arsenal of tradable assets. That suggests Toronto knows they need to make a move, but they're being picky about the return. And I get it. You don't want to give away a former second-round pick for nothing. But at some point, you have to accept reality. Robertson's value isn't what it was when he was drafted. He's not going to fetch a first-round pick or a top prospect. You're looking at a mid-round pick or a B-level prospect at best. And you know what? That's okay. Getting something is better than getting nothing, which is what Toronto will end up with if Robertson continues to languish on a roster, gets claimed on waivers, or walks away in free agency next summer. Brad Treliving needs to stop trying to maximize every last ounce of value and just make a deal that works for both sides. Let's talk about what a realistic trade package might look like. Based on Robertson's age, production, and current situation, I'd estimate something like this. Toronto Maple Leafs receive third-round pick in 2026 or a comparable prospect. Acquiring team receives Nick Robertson. That's it. That's probably the market. Maybe you can squeeze a second-rounder out of a desperate team, but more likely at a third or a prospect who's a few years away from NHL ready. And Toronto needs to be okay with that return, because the alternative is worse. The report mentions that we discuss Robertson potentially being part packages for bigger targets like Adrian Kemp or Nikolai Ehlers. That makes sense. Using Robertson as a sweetener in a larger deal could work. But if those bigger trades don't materialize, Toronto can't just keep Robertson around indefinitely hoping something better comes along. At some point, you need to cut bait and move on. From Robertson's perspective, this entire situation must be incredibly frustrating and demoralizing. He's 24 years old, prime development years for a forward, and instead of playing regular minutes and building his game, he's stuck in organizational limbo. He requested a trade over a year ago. He's gone to arbitration. He's done everything he can to either force his way into the lineup or force a trade. And yet here he is, still in Toronto, still uncertain about his future. And here's the thing. Robertson has shown he can score when given opportunity. He's got a legitimate NHL shot. He's got offensive instincts. He's not some scrub who can't play at this level. But he needs consistent ice time to develop and showcase those skills. He needs a team that believes in him and will give him a real chance. Toronto is clearly not that team, so why are they preventing him from finding one that is? There's also the human element to consider. This is a person's career we're talking about, not just an asset on a spreadsheet. Robertson is 24 years old. His window to establish himself as an NHL regular is closing. Every year he spends buried on Toronto's depth chart is a year he's not developing, not building his resume, not positioning himself for future contracts. At some point, Toronto has a moral obligation to do right by the player and give him the opportunity to succeed elsewhere if they're not going to use him. The fact that Dreger is reporting that Treliving has been talking with interested teams suggests that a trade could be imminent. Maybe something happens in the next few days or weeks. Maybe Toronto finally pulls the trigger and sends Robertson somewhere he can actually play. But I'm skeptical because we've been hearing similar rumors for over a year now and nothing has happened. What needs to change? Brad Treliving needs to make a decision. Either commit to Robertson, get him real ice time, put him in positions to succeed, and make him a genuine part of the roster, or trade him. This middle ground where he's technically on the team but not really playing helps nobody. It's bad for Robertson's development. It's bad for team morale. Other players see how he's being treated. And it's bad asset management for Toronto. My prediction, Robertson gets traded within the next month. The writing is on the wall. Dreger's report, combined with everything else we know, suggests that Toronto has finally accepted that this relationship isn't working. They'll find a team willing to give up a mid-round pick or a prospect. They'll make the deal, and Robertson will finally get his fresh start. And you know what? I think Robertson is going to thrive wherever he lands. He's going to get consistent ice time. He's going to play with confidence knowing the organization actually wants him. And he's going to show the offensive ability that made him a second-round pick. And Toronto is going to look back and wonder why they wasted so much time holding on to a player they clearly didn't value. This is a cautionary tale about organizational dysfunction and poor asset management. Toronto drafted Robertson, developed him in their system, and then failed to either utilize him properly or trade him when his value was higher. Now they're stuck trying to salvage whatever return they can get while the player's career hangs in limbo. It's not a good look, and it's not how championship organizations operate. What do you think, folks? Should Toronto just trade Nick Robertson already and end the saga? What's a fair return? A second-round pick? A third-rounder? A prospect? And where you think he should go to maximize his chances of success? Let me know in the comments. And if you're following along with all the latest Maple Leafs roster moves, trade rumors, and organizational drama, you absolutely need to hit that like button and subscribe. The season is underway, and there's going to be plenty more news and analysis coming your way. Don't miss a single update.